Travel writer Arthur Fromer wrote that, quote, "To travel best requires some time preparing for your visit to a particular location. That you don't travel anywhere without spending a few nights reading about the culture and history of the place you're visiting. This is what most of us don't do. We fling ourselves on an exotic destination hoping that someone will tell us what we are looking at. But by that time it's too late, and all the lectures and tour guides simply add to our confusion." Well, Fromer has a point. With that said, welcome back to the Down Periscope, Up Periscope podcast. I'm your host, Tim, and in this episode, I'll discuss why every tour guide on Blueback is just a bit different in how we give the tours. Interpretation. It's right up there with counterfactual as the dirty word of history. At least, in this day and age, anyway. There are many interpretations of historical events or objects, but mine just happens to be the right one. If you don't agree with me, then you are my mortal enemy. No, I'm just kidding. But I will say that like any historian worth their salt, I try to verify the facts and back them up with reputable sources. To that effect, my interpretation at least has some basis in reality. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that aliens built this submarine, it's run by the lizard people, or that the Earth is flat. I haven't sank to that level of delusions yet. Still, interpretation is a very tricky thing, since the final product has an element of subjectivity to it. One analogy I like to use is to imagine piecing together a very big and convoluted jigsaw puzzle. The individual pieces represent the facts, and the final image is the interpretation. The problem is that multiple different pieces can fit into the exact same spot, and many of the pieces don't mesh well together. Hence, there are multiple solutions to the puzzle, and if you do manage to put it all together, then the resulting picture, one of many valid solutions, is clear in some areas but blurry and ill-defined in others. It is then up to the individual to make out specific parts and interpret what they're seeing. This represents the objective and subjective elements of interpretations and explains why historians will broadly agree on certain facts, that is, the clear areas of the puzzle, but disagree on others, or the blurry areas. Such is the process of forming a coherent interpretation from various historical sources, and it explains why you can have multiple valid interpretations based on the same facts. Another way to think about it is, imagine police interviewing witnesses to a car crash. With 5 different witnesses, you will get 5 different stories. Before you know it, the cars are changing colors from blue to red to pink. Others say that the drivers were 2 males, or another one says it's a male and a female. And, well, what kind of cars were they? Oh, what time of day was it? Oh, did you see this from the beginning, or did you come in later? From what angle did you witness this accident? And the list goes on and on and on. And as I've said, memories are funny things, especially when it involves any kind of traumatic event. 5 years later, the stories will be different. So in terms of museums, at least museum interpretations, every museum has an interpretation of its exhibits. For example, the Iowa-class battleships are generally interpreted, that is, displayed, in their 1980s and early 1990s configuration, whereas the battleship North Carolina, from my understanding, is interpreted in her World War II configuration. Now, OMSI is no exception. As far as I know, Blueback is interpreted in her final configuration, with some exceptions. For example, the display cases on the bulkheads in the submarine are not original. They would have just been a blank space there, or maybe it used to be a bookshelf and it's been converted to a display case or something. A lot of the equipment on Blueback is original, much to the envy of other submarine museums out there, but all the classified equipment has been removed. This includes a good chunk of the radio equipment and one of the periscopes, which has been replaced with a non-classified one. She also displays a variety of torpedoes in her torpedo room, which spans several decades of technological weapons development. She did not carry all of them simultaneously when she was in service. Not to mention that she went into dry dock multiple times throughout her career, roughly once every couple of years, and got numerous upgrades during those times. So, Blueback is different from when she was originally commissioned in 1959. What's even more interesting is that doing a search on YouTube of various tours that people have taken of Blueback, I found most of the videos to be dating from, say, around the last 5 to 10 years, and those are relatively recent. I have found a couple of videos dating from around the year 2010, which seem kind of old nowadays, it's like 14 years old. But I've also found one video dating from 1997. Now that was 3 years after OMSI got the boat in 1994, and it was 1 year before Blueback last went into dry dock in 1998. And when I watched that video, the differences are really apparent. For example, 2 of the masts, the radar and the ECM mast, are still raised at that time. The position of some of the equipment and the position of some of the photos on the bulkheads inside the submarine is also different. From what I can tell, they still allowed visitors to turn or at least use the periscope handles, which you can't do anymore. For one thing, the handles, they don't come down anymore. You see in the movies, right? When the captain looks through a periscope, he throws down those 2 handles and puts his hands on the sides, Blueback does have those on our periscopes, but they're permanently strapped up. And in fact, what I should really do is actually do a reaction to this video on this podcast. I'll make a video, a vlog or whatever, so that would be pretty cool. But anyway, that's a little bit about its physical interpretation. There's a lot I could really go into when it comes to the differences, how the submarine has changed over the years and things like that. But, we'll get around to those things gradually. But this does bring us to tour guide interpretations. Now, as I mentioned in the second episode, the staff are hired to give quote-unquote interpretive tours on Blueback. You might be asking, what does that mean? Well, simply put, it means that we all have our own method for giving the tours. We're actually encouraged to quote-unquote make the tour our own, which means that it's expected that our tours will be different from another tour guide and not some cookie-cutter version. They're all very unique. We're not just rattling off the same facts, we're not making things up or twisting the numbers. Put another way, we do need to know this submarine front to back. That includes its technical characteristics, its history, and how it operates. Basically everything short of qualifying on this submarine if we were submariners in the Navy. There is a standardized training that we do go through to become the tour guides, and it was introduced sometime in the last 12 years with our last supervisor, but watching the video from 1997 actually shows that the content and presentation of the tours was fairly different from how we give them today. And even today, amongst all of us, we are different. Considering that all of our tours today are somewhat different from each other, the fact that the 1997 tour in the video is very different is really saying something. Of course, mistakes can happen, and our memories are not perfect. I have been known to fudge a few numbers on occasion myself. Other times, I'll round the numbers up or down. So for example, the Blueback is 219 feet 6 inches long, and I'll just round down and say, oh, it's 219 feet long. Does that extra half a foot really make much of a difference? Or I'll say that the ballast tanks hold 490 tons of water, which they do, from my understanding. But other times I'm going to round up and say they hold 500 tons. Well, there's a 10-ton difference there. So what? Are you going to crawl into the ballast tanks and measure their volume? Well, have fun. I'm not going to stop you. But yeah, things like that. So, as long as your ballpark, generally, we're within the same ballpark as with the numbers and things like that, then, those parts of the tour are generally the same. But one of the biggest misconceptions that I sometimes hear or I see on these videos, on the comments on YouTube, is that we tour guides all just memorize a script. Well, let me tell you, we don't. We do not. If it were that easy, then there would be no need for tour guides. We'd just hand you an audio recording and a pair of headphones and let you take the self-guided tour. But let's not give management any more clever ideas or we're going to be out of the job soon. The tours change, even if ever so slightly, depending on the group that we're leading. As I tell visitors, you could take the tour with 5 different tour guides, and you're going to get 5 different tours. at least to some extent. The vast majority of the tour is actually focused on the overall lifestyle of being on submarines. What is life like on a submarine? And only a fraction of the tour really deals with the technical aspects of Blueback herself. Now, it's understandable that people may get the impression that we've just memorized a script, especially if they've only taken a single tour, but if you've taken multiple tours, or if you watch enough videos on YouTube of Blueback tours, you'll actually find that they're all different. But they do have similarities, of course. Like I said, some of the numbers are going to be the same, others we're going to round up or down, things like that. To give a non-US example, if you've ever been to London, at the Tower of London, and taken a yeoman warder, aka a beefeater tour, or if you watch videos on YouTube of them, you'll notice that they all talk about similar subjects, but their delivery is different. They talk about King Henry VIII, Anne Boleyn, Traitors' Gate, the White Tower, and so on and so forth. And similarly, their tours are 45 minutes long, but they have to cram over like 900 years of history into their tours. And naturally, they don't have time to talk about everything on their tours, so they just have to pick and choose among a certain number of topics related to the Tower of London's history. And what that tells me is that they don't just memorize a script either. Their job is to tell stories, tell the history, and entertain the crowd. So they make up their tours as well. Of course, the requirements to become a beefeater are very specific. They need to have served in the British military for at least 22 years, they need to have become a warrant officer or a sergeant major, and they need to have received the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal. And then they can apply for the job if there's an opening. There's also a group of them called the Yeomen of the Guard, which serve as a ceremonial bodyguard to the monarch during certain ceremonies, things like that. But yeah, anyway, so the yeoman warders at the Tower of London, they each give their own tour, and their delivery is different and all that. I guess one upshot for them is that they and their families get accommodations within the tower. Also, their tour groups, from what I've seen from the videos, are huge, and the tour seems mostly one-sided. They mostly just talk at the audience, and they don't really take any questions. My point is that they have limitations on their tours as well, but they clearly have the freedom to make their tours their own. Now, getting back to Blueback, the reasons for the similarities and differences between the tours and the tour guides are as follows. Number one is time. It's the biggest limiting factor in how we give interpretive tours because we're trained to keep the tours to about 45 minutes, give or take. So on days when there are multiple tour guides working, there are going to be multiple tours occurring each hour. And this means a single tour guide will give about one tour an hour and about 6 or 7 tours throughout the entire day. And we cannot possibly fit everything about this submarine, its technology, or the relevant naval history into a single 45-minute tour. So we have to pick and choose what we're going to talk about. There are 7 stops on the tour route, including the dock, where the tour officially starts, so we have about 5 minutes at each stop. Now with 7 stops, that's going to bring it up to 35 minutes, and the remaining 10 minutes of that 45 minutes is allotted for moving between the spaces. Even then, we usually only talk for about 2 to 4 minutes in each space, and this is so we save a few minutes for questions at the end. We'll keep the discussion relevant to the space we're in. For example, if we're in the torpedo room, we're going to talk about the torpedoes, but save any discussion on submarine food for when we're in the crew's mess. Also, there's easily like 10 different things we can talk about in each space, but we only have time to talk about maybe 3 or 4 of them. Like, we could easily spend hours talking about the history of the Mark 14 torpedo, all of its problems, and how they fix them, but we just don't have that amount of time. So time is the limiting factor because we need to keep the tour moving. We can't just stop and talk about something for an hour because another tour is going to eventually come up behind us. One of the faux pas for the tour guides is to go so slow that the tours start backing up behind you. Like, if one tour backs up behind you, then it's just kind of an annoyance to that tour guide. But if 2 tours back up behind you, then they'll buzz you with the growler, the sound-powered telephone, and that means you really need to get a move on. Number 2 is our own interpretation. As docents, we each have our own interpretation of the submarine and how we present the tour. We come from different backgrounds. Maybe your tour guide was a fire control technician, or a machinist's mate, an electronics technician, a cryptologic technician, a quartermaster, or maybe even he was the captain of a submarine. Others are surface sailors, and some don't have any experience in any of the sea services. I previously mentioned that you don't need any sea service or experience on submarines to be a tour guide. That might seem a bit counterintuitive. You might be thinking, well, that doesn't make sense because logically you'd want tour guides with experience on submarines so they know what they're talking about. Well, my response is yes, that would be logical. But the reality is that being a submariner doesn't equate to being a tour guide, and all submarines are pretty much different anyway. According to the tour guides who are former submarine veterans, the only advantage being a submariner gives you as a docent is having some more sea stories to tell. However, here's the thing. You're not here to talk about your submarine. You're here to talk about Blueback. Yes, we can regale visitors with tons of sea stories, but remember that we're on a 45-minute time limit. Additionally, simply having served on submarines doesn't mean you know about Blueback herself. Even aboard active submarines, sailors that transfer to another class of submarine have to requalify on that one because it's different. Or maybe you transferred to a different boat of the same class. Well, there's gonna be some differences, so you're gonna have to requalify. Now, that may not take very long if it's the same type of boat, but there's still new things to learn, right? Maybe this piece of equipment is in a slightly different place, or maybe they do things slightly differently on this submarine than they did on your old submarine, or whatever. Now, as of 2024, we only have 2 tour guides who served on the 3 Barbell class subs. One served on the Barbell during her early service, and the other one served on both the Bonefish and the Blueback late in their service. Now, those 2 tour guides know this submarine better than any of us, so we always pick their brains when they come aboard. Like, hey, what's this thing do? What's that do? How did it work on your submarine and all that? Now, the only thing is that they're volunteer tour guides, so they can choose their own schedule, and it's not always regular. But even then, these guys mentioned that there were differences between all 3 of the Barbell submarines, since they were all built at different shipyards, and they were outfitted for different missions throughout their careers. Furthermore, we're talking about 2 men who are going off memories that are decades old. And in a later episode, I'm going to discuss more about doing historical research on this submarine, and all of the frustrations that that entails. Apart from those 2 tour guides, all of the submarine veterans on the staff served on different boats. Thus, they come to Blueback with a different experience, and thus a different interpretation of the boat and the lifestyle of submariners. They also interpret things differently depending on what they did in terms of their job or their rank or whatever. For example, our good captain is great at discussing the overall operations of submarines, while maybe another tour guide who may have been a former quartermaster may talk about the specifics of submarine navigation. Now, not all of the guys were lifers either. Some did only like 4 years or 6 years in submarines, others did 12, others did a full 20-year career or more. So the experiences of the tour guides span over 80 years, and most of them during the Cold War. However, that's appropriate given that Blueback did her time in service during the Cold War itself. Furthermore, given the fact that most of these guys are over 60 years old, not only are they going off of very old memories, but they've also had experiences outside the Navy. For example, one tour guide is also a Toastmaster. So he's really, really good at public speaking. And that gets into like how we deliver the tours itself. Some of us have like really deep, very sonorous voices, and they give a really good tour. Others are like, another guy, like I said, is a Toastmaster. He's really good at public speaking. Another person is a geologist, and they know about like the earth and things like that. So it's really cool listening to their tours. So we're all different in how we deliver the tour. And you could actually all give us the same information, and we'll find a different way to deliver that same information. So that's another way that makes the tours all different. And even the tour guides with no naval or submarine background still give really good tours because they made their tours unique. They made them their own. They have to know this boat just as any other tour guide does, and often they'll be able to work in their experiences into their tours as well. In their case, many of the crazy stuff they talk about comes from years of giving tours on Blueback. Oh, this one time I met a visitor who, served on Blueback. One of the former Blueback captains was on my tour and he told me this, that, and the other, so it's pretty cool. Anywho, the sheer variety of our backgrounds further accounts for the differences in our tours and how we give them. Number 3 is questions asked. The people on the tour and the questions they ask, if any, greatly influence the content of the tour. Now, as I mentioned in episode 2, the composition of the tour group affects how we present the information. If there's a lot of kids, then we're probably going to start simplifying the tour. If there's a lot of veterans, then we'll be a bit more detailed. And they also tend to ask more questions anyway. Conversely, the questions kids ask tend to be more simplistic, and they veer towards topics they're familiar with. Like, oh, what kind of food did they eat? Oh, can we get ice cream? Or why are there no windows on the submarine? Those types of things. And if people ask a lot of questions, then that does tend to lengthen the tour, but again, we try to keep the tour to around 45 minutes. In any case, the questions asked tend to change how the tour goes and what sort of information is presented. Now, naturally, there's going to be some people out there say like, oh, I took the tour like 5 times, and they're all the same, you guys always talk about the same stuff. Well, here's what I have to say to that. My recommendation is do a little homework about the submarine, then come up with some pointed questions you could ask the tour guide. Because asking a well thought out question shows us that you did your research. You didn't just show up with nothing intelligent to add. Now, there's one particular type of tour where it does feel like we're just reciting a scripted speech, at least from the perspective of the tour guide. These are what we call zombie tours. They're just tour groups that have literally no questions to ask. They come aboard the submarine, they take the tour, they look around, they say nothing the entire time. I'll be like, okay, so are there any questions about this base? Okay, well, moving on. Now, once we realize that we have a zombie tour group, then we sort of revert to that standard spiel we give because we just really want to get the tour group through the boat and get it over with. Now, of course, you don't have to ask questions if you don't want to. A lot of people come on board and they just don't have any questions, and that's fine. A group that has no questions merely speeds up the tour for us, and it makes the job that much easier. Anyway, so the aforementioned points make each tour different because every tour is with a different group of people, and all the tour guides bring different experiences to the submarine. We have different interpretations of Blueback, and we have a different way of delivering how we give those tours. In short, we each give the tour in our own way, and we each alter our tours depending on the group and the questions that are asked. So, that is a little bit about why every tour is different and how our interpretations of Blueback is different itself.